You. At the end of my last video, where I made some fences, I looked at the shipping containers and realized, hey, I didn't actually finish those, among a bunch of other terrain projects. But these shipping containers specifically, I did not paint. That is a phone call. For real? Hold on. That was weird. Some robocall that said, "We're watching you," followed by a bunch of heavy breathing, and then they just hung up. Weird. Sorry about that. So yeah, I painted up the metal banding on these, like so, and it became apparent to me why I didn't finish these. It's because I made 10 of them, and will never make any more again. I wanted to weather them up, just like this one here, and if you can tell by the sheen on these, I used wood stain. The color's a little bit richer on these than using just an acrylic wash. I did use acrylic wash on a couple of them, but I had to go over them a couple times to get the right kind of saturation of the wash. And I didn't record making these shipping containers because I just followed Mel the Terrain Tutor and Blackmagic Crafts tutorials. So instead of retreading what other people have already done and done better, we're just gonna move on. I made this thing back in January, whatever the hell this is. At the time it seemed cool, but it's too tall for what I'm trying to go for, and it doesn't even really make any sense, even in the most fictional of science fiction. So let's cut this thing up and see if we can make something better out of it. Again, I don't really know what I'm doing here. I'm just making it up as I go. Hopefully it turns out better than the first time I did this. I guess I didn't mention it, but I guess now would be a good time to mention. This video is just me fixing and finishing all the terrain projects I've worked on during the year, but I wasn't really satisfied with them, and that's why, well, partially why I haven't been releasing videos as frequently, because I'll get started on these terrain projects, not like them, and then just kind of stare at them all day. So I finally decided I'm finishing all these projects, and I'm going to force myself to do it, and that's why this video is so late. If you've watched 2001: A Space Odyssey, you know HAL 9000. Well, this is like HAL 6500, his little cousin or something. This could be an objective marker. I don't know. I drilled holes in the side of this 2" by 1.5" coupler, and I glued in some printer buttons. The bottom one I had to kind of shim up with some paper. Yeah, and then I spray painted it black and then silver. And then I went about adding a bunch of tubes and wires to it to hide the PVC pipe support in the middle. I think it probably could have used like a keypad or something so that it would make a little bit more sense. I'm fine with it. And for the other part of that terrain, I'm just swapping these two different bottles, hot gluing all that together, and then cutting away the hot glue so it's not obviously hot glued and more smooth looking. It actually ends up looking like one cohesive piece once it's painted. And then I glue back on these toy pipes that are definitely toys and not approved for actual plumbing. Won't make that mistake again. You see a lot of hobby YouTubers use them. Whatever, I derailed myself with my own dumb joke. Moving on. And I made the hobby terrain staple of the soda can fuel tanks. Well, I guess they don't have to be fuel tanks. They could have like milk in them or something. I don't know. I'm from the Midwest. Like, that's what I'm most familiar with. One thing I might have done a little bit differently is I drilled out the rivets on a clipboard from the Dollar Tree, which was $1, and used that for the base and glued everything onto that. Cheap, sturdy base. And I wanted to make some walkways, and I found this basket also at the Dollar Tree. So I'm just gonna cut a section of this out. And I end up making this the underside of the walkway because I didn't like how raised up it was. But then I just glued that to some knitting mesh. I thought the rim of the basket made a pretty good handrail, so I glued that on there. It's a little tall, but it looks like a handrail, so yeah. And then I framed the entire knitting mesh with some cereal cardboard just to tie it all together. I didn't want to cut out individual strips of chipboard and glue them together, so I thought it'd be really clever to make some I-beams. Whoa, hey, not I-beams, girders. Girders, you psycho. And I picked up a 10-pack of these plastic hangers and cut those up, and they work pretty good. I notched out some little support beams that I glued in, and then glued the whole thing to the walkway. And I also added some ladders to each side. We'll talk about the ladders a little bit more later. I gave it a basic paint job. I just kind of skipped over that for the video. But then it came to basing the base. Oh, you don't say. So I mixed up a bunch of wood glue, paint, baking soda, a little bit, and a couple scoops of construction sand. I mix all that stuff together. I didn't really like the color, so I couldn't find just regular black paint, so I poured a little bit of the black paint and Mod Podge mixture. I almost said Mod Podge. Is that like a Mandela effect thing? Because I know a lot of people call it Mod Podge, but it's Mod Podge. Kind of like a Berenstain Bears sort of situation. Anyway, I just slather the entire base with this mixture. This next piece I made from a Clorox disinfecting wipes container. Just glued some cardboard to the bottom of it. I made a bunch of these hex head bolts or rivets, whatever you want to categorize them as, by just pouring some resin on a silicone pot holder I got at Walmart around Christmas time. It was like 88 cents. So I poured resin once, and hopefully we'll have these hex head rivets for a ton of stuff. I got this plastic paint strainer from Menards. I think it's more of a regional home improvement store. And I'm going to make some ladders out of it. I went to so many different dollar stores to try to find the tennis rackets that Eric from Eric's Hobby Workshop uses, but all they have is like the wire badminton rackets, so I'm gonna go with these paint strainers. I think they're like $1.50 or something like that. To provide handrails to go all the way to the top of the tank, I used a lighter to melt some plastic rod, and then I shaped it around just a pen to get that curvature to it. The left one's a little bit mangled, but the right one turned out okay. I made some safety poles to put on each corner of the base out of some cut up pens that no longer worked, and then meticulously cut little pieces of plastic rod and super glued them on for like the bolts that hold it in place. You could still very easily back right into the tank. You would need at least one more on each side for them to be effective, but gluing the pieces on each corner of the safety pole was super time consuming and frustrating, so we're just going to keep the 4 and call it good. I bent the sides of the paint strainer to act as handrails around the top. Just don't walk out by that far edge and you'll be fine. Then I added some greeblies from a printer I took apart, like buttons and inner workings and stuff, and the lid to a toothpaste tube, funny enough, and I glued those together like so. I made some stencils with the Cricut and cut them out on some cheap contact paper, the removable stuff. Different numbers and like silhouettes from some of my characters to help with graffiti, which you'll see the graffiti stuff in the final shots, but for this I just applied the number, stippled on white paint, hopefully to make it look a little bit more rough. And then removed the stencil while it was still wet to keep the lines pretty clean. Oh, and here's a Nurgle symbol that you'll see on the final shots as well. But we're not done yet. Kind of losing my mind over here. I cut a roughly 4 foot by 3 foot section of canvas drop cloth to make a battle mat, and I'm following a mix of Mel the Terrain Tutor and Eric's Hobby Workshop's tutorials on this. I made a mixture of brown paints, construction sand, and acrylic caulk, but used way too much sand. So as I was working this mixture into the canvas, the sand just kind of kept flaking off and not really retaining any of that texture. So I waited for it to dry and then went back and hit it with a mixture of wood glue and more brown paint, and that seemed to do the trick and didn't have sand flaking off anymore. But the mat was still flexible enough to roll up for easy storage. I went through a cycle of dry brushes and washes to get it to look like this, and you can see this clump of sand is stand put, which wouldn't have happened if I didn't hit it with the wood glue. Now we're done. I'm glad that I pushed myself to finish all this stuff, to finally have it done and then have something to photograph my miniatures on. That probably means I'm gonna also have to paint those too, aren't I? And I'm super excited to finally be able to start new projects. I don't know how well this video will do, but I hope it inspires you to finish terrain projects that you have half completed, or maybe does the exact opposite, I don't know. I plan on getting back to conversions and kit bashes, so subscribe if you're interested in that stuff. And while you're at it, how about you drop kick that like button through a car windshield, if you could, if you knew the amount of editing I had to do on that. Anyways, thanks for watching, and I will see you soon.